Welcome to the Challenges of the New Space Age. Today's keynote panel is made possible in part by a grant from Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. We're joined today by our two very distinguished panelists, Izumi Nakamitsu and Sean O'Keefe. And if they could please turn on their cameras, that would join me on stage, as it were, that would be terrific. Ms. Nakamitsu is Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations. Prior to taking on this post, she served as Assistant Administrator for the Crisis Response Unit at the United Nations Development Program. She's incredibly knowledgeable about issues surrounding space and arms control, something especially relevant given today's conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and concerns about the way that conflict escalation could involve issues surrounding assets and satellites in space. Mr. Sean O'Keefe is currently a faculty member at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He previously served as NASA Administrator, Secretary of the Navy, and Chairman and CEO of the Airbus Group, the North American subsidiary of the Global Aerospace Defense and Space Corporation, where he's also a member of the Corporate Executive Committee. Thanks to both of you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and willingness to engage with us on these issues. I'm going to turn the floor over to Ms. Nakamitsu for her opening remarks, followed by Mr. O'Keefe, and then we'll have a moderated conversation and turn to audience questions. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. And the floor is yours to our panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Horowitz, Mr. O'Keefe, Dr. Horowitz, and ladies and gentlemen. It is really a great pleasure for me to speak today about the efforts of the United Nations in the field of space security. Thank you very much for the invitation, but I have to warn you that I'm here to learn also, especially from Mr. O'Keefe. I'm not a greatest expert on this issue, but today we are really seeing, I think, an increased use of space, both by civilian and military actors. And there is a renewed interest in the exploration and use of outer space, and space assets also have become an integral part of our really everyday life. And at the United Nations, we have actually come to realize that outer space is essential to fulfilling our biggest and, I would say, more urgent priorities, including the Sustainable Development Goals and fighting climate change, for example. Now, the private sector is driving much of this progress. The commercial sector is becoming the dominant provider of space launch services and already operates the majority of functional satellites. And at the same time, of course, the renewed geopolitical competition is threatening to spill over in the outer space, and political technological developments are also increasing risks that terrestrial military confrontation could be really extended into outer space. An increasing number of states are treating outer space as a potential domain of active hostility, and some are developing and deploying dedicated anti-satellite systems. And it is very clear that active hostilities in outer space would entail catastrophic consequences. Even a small number of intentional attacks or accidents could render vital orbits unusable. And this would disrupt critical services such as satellites used for telecommunications, positionings, and navigation, Earth observation, the internet weather forecasting, and many more. The elaboration of legal and regulatory regime governing outer space, on the other hand, has not kept pace with current developments. The governance gap, if you will, creates a risk that increasing congestion and competition could imperil access and use by future generations. The governance gap also creates uncertainty relating to the development and use of so-called dual-use objects and activities that could be essential for ensuring the long-term sustainability of outer space. Now, the purpose of satellite designed for active debris removal or servicing and extending life of a spacecraft could be misunderstood or without clear regulation and agreed norms. Disruptive and irreversible means for interfering with satellites through various means, for example, electromagnetic interference, jamming, cyber attacks, or laser dazzling, etc., could also result in unintended escalation. For example, it is unclear how a nuclear-armed state might react if it loses control of a space asset it regards as critical national security infrastructure or that it uses for early warning. So in the 6 decades since the first satellite was launched into space, the United Nations has been the instrumental platform for developing rules of the orbit, if you will. On security and disarmament matters, over the past decade, government expert groups have made actually progress on narrowing differences and on elaborating transparency and confidence building measures. It must be acknowledged, of course, that the current international environment might very much complicate our current efforts to preserve outer space as a domain for peaceful use and as a global commons, if you will. Yet, we remain committed to supporting the active efforts of member states to prevent an arms race in outer space through a combination of binding and non-binding norms, rules, principles, guidelines, and other effective measures. This includes support for the open-ended working group established this year by the General Assembly to reduce space threats through the development of norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. The Secretary General has also recognized the urgency of making progress on space security and arms control. In his report, Our Common Agenda, he called for a multi-stakeholder dialogue on outer space as part of a summit of the future, which is to be convened in the autumn of 2023. We hope that member states will seize this opportunity to mandate the negotiation of a new instrument to build on the Outer Space Treaty and to extend the legal regime governing outer space to address contemporary security challenges. Such an instrument could, at a minimum, seek to prohibit the testing or use of anti-satellite weapons that are likely to generate large amounts of long-lived space debris. Now, I started by outlining the great benefits that this peaceful use of outer space has provided to humanity. We must now take this opportunity to take steps to supplement existing international legal regime governing outer space with the legal and political norms necessary to ensure its sustainable use for future generations. The UN Office for Disarmament Affairs will continue to assist member states in their negotiations and deliberations to these ends. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your comments and ideas. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Well, thank you, Dr. Horowitz, and Madam Secretary, it is a real distinct privilege to be with you this morning as well. So I thank you very much for your willingness to participate in this discussion, which I think will inform the dialogue as we go forward. In contemplating the theme of the panel discussion for this morning, of looking at what the challenges are of the new space age, I think, Madam Secretary, you struck the chord exactly right. The primary issue is, in a very near-term circumstance, is that space, low Earth orbit in particular, is becoming very crowded. This is a neighborhood that was presumed at one point to be an open domain that would pose no significant threat given the sheer volume. that has turned into quite a busy place. And as a consequence, it's only getting more so exponentially here. Currently, there are some 2,800 active satellites in orbit right now. That's due to increase on an annual basis by at least 1,200 a year. So we're seeing a rapid escalation of that effort just by virtue of the introduction of this incredible commercial space economy. The current international economy or an interspace economy itself is estimated at well over $400 billion and rising every year. 80% of that is commercial in its orientation. So as a consequence, this is not something that even an agreement among and between governments to regulate their own public behavior in this regard is going to have the dominant impact on this. This is something that requires a very, very concerted effort to engage commercial industry and buy-in from a much broader sector going forward. This commercial space access, again, is just a stunning development in this new space age, in which we see SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, and many, many others building the capacity not only to access space with more satellites, more communications equipment, more technical capacities that could be employed to improve everyday operations in life here on Earth, but we're also seeing this as a means to transport humans. As this becomes a more accessible space domain for the human experience itself, that's clearly their articulated goal from a commercial standpoint, is to make this as accessible and ubiquitous as what we see in commercial air travel today. That was the imagined expectation 100 years ago that ultimately has come to pass, that we experience and enjoy today in a way that is really routine. We're not on the cusp of that quite yet, but it certainly is a promise of that going forward. And that's clearly what these early space human exploration kind of entrepreneurs are hoping for to move this forward going into this case. None of this was contemplated at the time that the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was enacted. I mean, the notion that somehow this would expand to this degree was really not considered a likely near-term proposition. And in fact, it wasn't. It turned out it took the better end of 50 years prior to the time that this could become available. But that tracks pretty closely with commercialization of airspace, the same way we've seen commercial aviation occur across the Earth, where we can go just about anywhere on this planet by commercial aircraft easily from an airport that's accessible to most citizens around the globe. So as a consequence, this is becoming something that we can almost pattern and see what the development is going to be going forward. But at the time the 67 treaty was agreed to, the notion, the backdrop that was assumed at that period was that this space would be a public good. And the public good in the classical economic definition is it's non-rivalrous. If any one of us uses any aspect of it, it doesn't erode or degrade the capability of another to do the same. Well, that's turned out not to be the case, just by sheer volume. And it's something we really are dealing with on a regular basis to assure deconfliction, avoidance of collisions, as the Undersecretary General just touched on a few moments ago here, going through the challenges of what those kinds of accidents and occurrences could create going forward. So as it stands right now, the liability that is to be assumed as a consequence of that was envisioned in the 1967 treaty to be a national liability, because it was anticipated that all of this would be public access related kind of access to space. Now we've got an entirely different domain in which it's well overwhelmed by the amount of commercial traffic that's out there, and how that sorts out within the broader liability and insurance coverage and so forth is an important feature. But most important in all that is the mere fact that the amount of tracking that goes on right now is uneven, to say the least. US tracks roughly 1,000 satellites and about 21,000 pieces of debris that are larger than 4 inches, 10 centimeters, big enough to destroy a satellite on collision. I mean, this is just a real threat or risk that could pertain in that case, and the reason why the US tracks that. Nonetheless, that doesn't account for a fraction of what we're about to see in a much larger scale. And I think, as the Undersecretary General described, we're just beginning to get into a rules of the orbit kind of condition in which we can establish a protocol which is voluntarily assumed, which is in the best interest of everyone involved, but it now involves a lot more actors and participants than state actors going forward. Every commercial industry that wants to participate now, any one of which that chooses not to for whatever reason, and again, it's a difficult challenge to enforce, makes this a higher risk going forward. So I think that's the near term kinds of challenges, is the sheer volume of what we're about to be dealing with, and it's growing exponentially as we're progressing along. The second major, I think, new space age development and challenge that I think is looming is the frequency, again, of so much of what we can police, what we can enforce as behavior that we expect of state actors. Not, any more recently than November of last year, the Russians launched an anti-satellite missile for the purpose of testing the destruction of a Russian satellite that was inactive, just to determine exactly whether that could be accomplished. Nonetheless, that created better than 1,500 pieces of debris that in turn is going to remain in orbit now, that adds to that trove of incredible volume of debris and active space satellites that we see going forward here. That's only going to increase as we go forward. So the enforcement of so much of what was intended behind the ASAT, anti-satellite missile treaty and understanding going forward, really is something that needs to be considered as a more anticipated threat in the next phase beyond this volume issue. And the last piece of this is just the militarization of space, the ultimate concern that was the basis of the 1967 Outer Space Act Treaty. And it really did anticipate this could be happening much sooner. Nonetheless, it's happening now. We're on the cusp of that. It is not an immediate proposition, but it's one that looms. And as it does, so much of what the Undersecretary General just defined here in her comments really pertains to the imperative of why we need to control that. So that sets the stage that is really dominated by those 3 points. So I think of sheer volume is drawing our attention to this, and our attention needs to be drawn now to the sheer crowding of what we see in the space domain. Number 2 is the frequency of which we see existing kind of understandings that need to be enforced and enforced much more rigorously. And the third of which I think is one in which our ultimate fear of militarizing space is something that has to be on the radar for constant consideration going forward. And so with that, I turn it back to you, Dr. Horowitz. Thank you.
Thanks so much to both of you for those tremendous opening remarks. I already feel smarter about outer space. And to start in asking questions, let me ask this, which is you both sort of talked in different ways a bit about some of the challenges that exist when it comes to international cooperation on space, and the role that existing treaties have played when it comes to space. So why don't we start with you, Undersecretary, and then turn to you, Mr. O'Keefe. What do you think are the prospects for these international agreements to be an effective basis for shared norms and cooperation, or should we be then thinking about new agreements if we want to sustain cooperation in space in a more competitive era?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, if I may, for that very important question. And I mean, this obviously is the theme of this panel, so we will keep coming back to this. But let me just say that, interestingly, in the context of international security and in the context of the UN platforms, member states, experts groups, we have something called governmental expert groups. In those platforms, member states actually have been able to make progress on narrowing differences and also elaborating, transparency and confidence building measures. I mean, specifically, you might actually say that's nothing, but there is, I think, a general agreement, which I think is very important, on the need to update the governance agreements in outer space. I think there is generally speaking, agreement on that. And then second, all states really appear to share the goal of preventing active hostilities in outer space. And that they also want to, they seem to agree that there has to be some sort of efforts to codifying, if you will, this goal in some form of international instruments. Now, the differences are, of course, whether those instruments should be legally binding ones or non-legally binding ones. And then, of course, in the international security context, disarmament, arms control context, how to verify those agreements is always a really key issue. But there is differences of view, among states on this. And the second interesting differences of the view is that extent to which measures should focus on military capabilities itself or regulating state behaviors. Especially this looking at the responsible behavior part is a relatively new concept which emerged in international disarmament discussions when those dual use technologies, whether that is cyber issues or the AI, etc., those things actually really it started to interfere with the security issues. They are more focused on behavior of states, what constitutes responsible behavior, what constitutes irresponsible behaviors, and what might be a threatening behavior. So there are those differences, but member states have been able to make some progress. Now, from my perspectives, the UN's perspectives, these two tracks, if you will, really should be mutually reinforcing, and that it is clear that elaboration of norms, rules, and principles of behavior can also contribute to a future development of legally binding measures as well. So I think it's important to remember this broader context within which experts have been having, interesting deliberations and discussions and making some progress. And then we can touch on, what could constitute a sort of nucleus of, immediate agreements, which also Mr. O'Keefe mentioned, banning anti-satellite systems. I mean, this, I think, is a really acute issue. Everyone was really scared of this November last year Russian testing, which really indeed created 1,500 debris. And I heard that both Russian and American astronauts in International Space Station, they had to spend a night in the evacuation capsule together. So, I mean, there are, future work that really needs to be urgently conducted in terms of strengthening norms and agreements.
Absolutely. This is the very tenets of so much of what has gone into the development of any international governance structure, any global governance structure, was an agreement among all nation states that this would in no way substitute for our own individual nation state interests in the enforcement of rule of law. Okay, that established at least an understanding among nation states that it is to our best interest to reach cooperative agreements. But at the same time, no nation state was anxious to want to empower a international enforcement capability for any of the treaties. Okay, so as a consequence of that, we're faced with this dilemma, which is a willingness, a coalition of the willing. Everybody must be part of the coalition of the willing to make this something that assures the safety of this domain. And that is always, always a precarious assumption. I mean, even the November events of last year are such that I think the very important action that was taken by the United Nations, and I commend you, Madam Secretary, and those as part of the initiative to really recognize this for what this was. Better than, as I remember, it's something like 163 nation states all agreed to condemn this action and said, this is unacceptable. It completely violates the principles of the Outer Space Treaty conventions and everything else that we had agreed to as part of the protocols. And what was agreed to at that time, or at least proposed, was to put together an open-ended working group to convene to start looking at what the consequences would be of working through some of these challenges, how to enforce them differently, how to compel behavior. And I think of great note was that the Russians and the Chinese objected, formally objected to the formation of a working group. So this is something in which, we've got a challenge going forward of dealing with how do you enforce any of these logical, rational, behavioral approaches to these situations in which any individual nation state can in turn then object and understand that they can withdraw from the whole condition. Well, that means that we've really got to put together protocols that compel the superior logic of our own self-interest to actually make these things work correctly. And that generally has worked pretty successfully. Law of the sea, all manner of different things have really come to be, which are not an enforceable proposition as much as they are something that is so rational as to suggest that adherence to these basic principles is the best way to avoid danger to ourselves, any individual nation state, any company, any individual who's involved. If you adhere to these basic fundamental protocols, that's what's going to minimize the risk to you. That's the part that it's a tall order to reach that stage in which rational thought always is the driving proposition of self-governance. And that's a long way to get around it, but this is a tough one because we don't want to step over that line and then in turn try to enforce something that compels individual sovereign nation states to make decisions that is not in everybody's best interest to do.
So let me turn now to what I would say is the elephant in the room, so to speak, which is the ongoing conflict, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Russia and the United States, as the discussion of the November incident suggests, or certainly have had both a cooperative and a competitive relationship in space over the decades. And there have certainly been concerns about efforts to target satellites, sort of other things that might just sort of happen in a conflict in general. Sort of a curious, maybe we'll start with you this time, Mr. O'Keefe. If either of you could you maybe give us a sense of how you think the conflict might influence the prospects for cooperation in space, or whether you're seeing anything basically surround, on that issue, and maybe do we need to worry about that in the context of this conflict?
Yes, I think we're ironically, we are back to a condition today where we're getting a very deep dose of what was a predominant proposition during the Cold War of game theory and the whole game modeling focus, which was for every action that we exert, does that in turn motivate a more severe action on the part of those who possess the capabilities to met destruction on ourselves? And that's what's withholding so much of what we see within not only the individual nation states, but also the alliance partners in trying to control the behavior that everyone internationally, with notable exceptions of maybe half a dozen nation states, roundly condemn as actions that are absolutely unacceptable. I mean, this is fundamental principles of Westphalia, of hundreds of years ago, that the very proposition of standing back and letting a larger nation state that feels as though it has the capacity to do so overwhelm a smaller one. That's not an acceptable and civil arrangement that maintains any order in a global context. So as a result of that, we're having this difficulty now understanding that to the extent we use the capabilities we have in order to compel behavior that would avoid these kinds of conditions, that in turn risks escalation of the very conflict itself. And that's the concern that I think is most dominantly being concentrated in the undercurrent, if you will, of the options being considered by NATO, by the United States, by any other individual nation state as part of the Western Alliance, as well as within Japan, Australia, et cetera. Every one of them are all now thinking in terms of every step we make that will in turn deter Russian behavior in this circumstance, risk the prospect of escalating this conflict to another level, which could in fact include not only the nature of warfare here perpetrated on Earth, but also from space. And any one of those factors, I think, could bring this to a larger proposition. And again, this is a complete turn in which the very capability and the means to enforce in turn becomes a risk to escalation as a consequence of that. And that's the dilemma we're really wrestling with today.
Madam Secretary?
Yes, this Russian invasion and ongoing war in Ukraine will definitely have far-reaching consequences and impact on everything that we do at the international level. And we are still sort of assessing what exactly those impacts will be on many different streams of work that we do. The good news is that, it has not had a direct effect on the current cooperation in outer space. The Russian and American astronauts continue to work side by side on the International Space Station, for example. But at the same time, the war is likely to deepen existing cooperation. I heard, for example, just last week, the European Space Agency canceled a joint Mars mission it had been planning with Russia. And even before the Ukrainian war, the Russian Federation and the United States had already begun working on separate plans for their activities in low Earth orbit after the end of the operational life of the International Space Station. So, I mean, the sort of separate ways, etc., I think is probably starting, we will start to see that. But I think it's really important that cooperation in outer space should be preserved and is possible expanded further in, even in today's really completely complicated security environment. And the reason is that I see a real risks because of the current divide. I mean, just to give you three very concrete examples of risks that we see. I mean, obviously the top one is the active hostilities in outer space will really present a tremendous risk. I mean, I don't even need to elaborate on that. But even harmful interference, if you will, with space-based early warning systems, for example, could also have unintended and dangerous escalatory consequences. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, how would a nuclear weapon state behave? We don't know if they loses control of a space asset that it regards as critical national security infrastructure, or if that is the one that is being used for early warning, for example. So very clear risk in terms of security. And then finally, I think the possible emergence of, if you will, diverging governance regimes, for example, for exploiting natural resources, maintaining a permanent human presence outside Earth orbits, things like that, resulting from the current geopolitical competition could also pose a real risk. And this could make interstate cooperation in outer space activities even more difficult, and then could increase the risk of misunderstandings and miscommunications. So, all of those things actually depends on whether we will be able to continue somehow with international cooperation, if at all possible, when things calm down and when the conflicts are resolved, go back to expanding those cooperation, I think is really, really critical. We say that outer space is also for future generations, and I think the future depends on today.
Great, thank you. We're going to turn to audience questions in a few moments. And so if members of the audience have questions that they want to ask, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface. And I wanted to actually ask him, and I realize this isn't exactly about international security, but it sort of touches on it, to get a sense. Maybe we can start with you, Madam Secretary, and then you, Mr. O'Keefe, of what you thought the future was of the International Space Station, and in that there were a lot of questions about it even before the Ukraine conflict, obviously with the agreement slated to end, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's been such an important locus for cooperation in space. What do you think the future holds? You're muted, Madam.
Sorry, yes. Yeah, no, I mean, this International Space Station, the two Cold War rivals came together to cooperate in the conception of it and then in the operation of this International Space Station. This is one of the longest and most complex space projects. I've always wanted to visit International Space Station. I advocated that I have to go on the field visit, fact-finding mission. It hasn't happened, and it will probably never happen. But I think it has also it's been a symbol and a political sort of significance of, outer space as a, common space. There is no one state that will govern, and I think that spirit really needs to be preserved, and that's one of the reasons why the UN Secretary General wanted to have this, he wants to organize future summit in the autumn of next year. And outer space issue is one of the sort of center focus of this, future summit. And I think, if we can start actually by trying to agree to mandate member states to start negotiating some sort of a traffic coordination treaty, and then build on outer space treaty, what we already have. But as Mr. O'Keefe said, this is more than half a century old, and technological developments and new challenges definitely have arisen in the meantime. So, building on this outer space treaty, there will have to be new instruments, that will, sort of enshrine and that will put together a future cooperation in outer space. And I think the time to start that will be next year at the Future Summit. And we are now starting to have a lot of conversations. A very important point here is that unlike the previous time, this time we need to work with private sector. Outer space agreements, norms, and principles. There is no point in just putting together governments to discuss. We need the participation of private sector, industry, scientists, engineers, etc. Without their expertise and their vision for future cooperation, we would not be able to come up with agreement that will be sustainable into the future. So, the dialogue such as this one that we are engaged in at the moment will be critical. And I hope that there will be lots of conversations like this that will prepare the grounds for Future Summit, which will then be meeting us all to some sort of a new project that is similar in terms of a significance symbol, like the International Space Station has been until now.
No, I think, Madam Secretary, you put your finger right on it. This has been the most remarkable platform, the International Space Station, for the continuation of diplomatic engagement by another means that has withstood the test of time. And its origins, interestingly, are reach back to the Apollo-Soyuz era in the 1970s, in which that first engagement in the really depth of the Cold War made it possible for the engagement of two superpowers who ultimately could see common ground in this unique domain. There was no doubt about it. And that evolved to Shuttle Mir during the course of that time in the 1990s, which now has resulted in the full expanse of what we see in the International Space Station, which is 16 nation states that are heavily invested in the continuation of that remarkable laboratory in space. So it is, at least the agreements as of right now, as you said, Michael, at the beginning of this, the agreements were debatable prior to the emergence of the Russia-Ukraine conflict to begin with. That this would be a platform that would be continually operational through debatable points back and forth between all five of the major partners, the US, the Russians, the European Space Agency, the Canadians, and the Japanese, that there be a continuation at least through the bulk of this decade. I think we're going to continue to revisit that, but it's going to be based on the proposition of the development of the Gateway program and the Artemis opportunities and any number of different projects that are coming forward that are international in their collaborative focus, their intent to be global participatory in any individual nation state that seeks to participate in the activity, for the Artemis Accords, for example, as it pertains to the lunar establishment of infrastructure and so forth. Those are the best opportunities, I think, to really capitalize on what the Undersecretary has talked about here, of having a collaborative arrangement that then in turn helps inform the very rules of behavior that in turn become the standards of conduct that are in everybody's best interest. And those are the activities going forward. And the International Space Station is the platform now that has made so much of that possible, because we now know how and have had a lot of experience, 20 years continuously of operating in space, 365 days a year. It's a stunning achievement to always have a human in space at this stage aboard that capability. There is little doubt that that's going to continue on in each of these successive endeavors going forward. So how we continue to develop those capabilities and in turn understand what's in our best interest by those means is what will help inform these protocols that I think, again, we can adopt on an international basis.
Thanks so much. I now want to turn to some questions from the audience. I was waiting very patiently. We have a bunch of questions building up. The first question asks about you both mentioned the private sector in different sorts of ways, and one area that we haven't spent as much time discussing yet is space tourism. Of course, there's all of the imagery of the American or international billionaires heading to space over the last year. So if space tourism is about to become a real thing, what do you think the effect will be on the accessibility of space and also the impact on any dangers in thinking about something like space debris? I don't know who wants to go first.
I'm sorry.
I don't know.
I'll take.
Why don't you go first, Mr. O'Keefe, and then Madam Secretary.
Sure. I think this is, there is no question that this is happening. I mean, it's all evolving really real time, and we're seeing that capability. And again, the path I tried to draw the parallel to in the opening comments was this is patterning exactly the same set of developments that civil aviation did, of commercial airspace travel that we enjoy today. This is the same pattern. I mean, this is precisely the same capability. We're building on the capacity that was started in the early 1960s of launching humans to space. And it has changed drastically. What has been introduced by the commercial sector are some incredible innovations, some fantastic advancements, improvements, and so forth, new technology, and the ability to really maximize the efficiency of access. The same way that commercial aviation came to be, this is happening yet again. The big difference is that what's occurring here is we're using exactly the same means to access space today that we used in 1961 when it was first achieved, to put a human in space. And that's chemical propulsion. I mean, it is still a controlled explosion under the best of circumstances. This has not changed and altered all that much relative to any of the designs that have already been achieved by the commercial access folks. So the pace of how possible it may be to become ubiquitous, to make it accessible for any of us, anybody, to travel to space, is going to depend heavily on the capacity to minimize that inherent risk. Once there, too, there is no question the frequency in which we're seeing the access to space now by commercial companies is going to take the very topics of what we've spent our time talking about for the last 45 minutes to a much higher crescendo of debate, because it involves human risk now to a higher level, not just some conceptual thought that maybe this will affect International Space Station crew members or any other unique circumstance. This is going to be citizens being threatened as a consequence of space debris, et cetera, all the things we've talked about, that will make this particular imperative one that several of these companies are going to want to engage. And I think, again, as the Undersecretary mentioned very, very clearly, is this is different from 1967. where it was nothing but nation states we were dealing with, in which governments were the ones that were the only ones capable of doing these things, that today we're now in a mode in which we've got to include a whole range of different commercial partners in any discussion about this to make sure those protocols are in fact not only enforceable, but actually reflect the behavior that they intend to follow through with. And all of that now for the higher cost of not just the threat to some investment of a satellite, it's now the threat to human life. And that's going to really bring up the volume on this debate because of the capability to do so on a more frequent basis.
Yeah, I would just simply add to everything that Professor O'Keefe said. I mean, all the more reason if the space tourism is going to be a future, a big tourism, all the more reason why we need to have better governance systems, better regulations, including in traffic management. I mean, at the moment, there is no traffic coordination rules in outer space. For safety and security of space travelers, you would want one. So another reason to have this kind of cooperation and have discussions on it.
Our next question comes from Dr. Jim Tucci and asks, and why don't we start with you on this one, Madam Secretary, since it's actually about a United Nations issue, asks about responsibility to protect and whether in a more contested space arena, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but let me just read it. Does the notion of a responsibility to protect extend into space? Should the United Nations or maybe the United States intervene to protect space assets, which are vital to the security and well-being of humanity?
The responsibility to protect is a sensitive and contested notion at the UN multilateral platforms. But one that I would like to actually emphasize is that it also stressed the importance of national sovereignty as a responsibility rather than a right as well, right? So I would first and foremost argue that states all member states have a responsibility to behave in a responsible manner so that no one needs to be, sort of intervening to protect. I mean, I think operationally, I wonder how to intervene to protect what assets, what would you like to protect and how? I think there's a very big operational and technical questions about that as well. But I would like to stress the importance of responsibility part of member states in terms of always behaving in a responsible manner.
Mr. O'Keefe, do you want to jump in on this one, or?
Simply to concur, I think that's a very clear expression of exactly what we need to be focused on here. Again, even the 1967 treaty assumed that the ultimate sovereignty of a nation was a responsibility in these circumstances. And so therefore, to the extent there were any events, the treaty called out very explicitly that nation state would be liable, be responsible for the activities. How you enforce that, that's the bigger question going forward. And it's one, again, we've sought to avoid anything that would make this a global policeman, dealing with these kinds of questions, principally because it overwhelms the sovereignty. And that's something we've been loath to want to go that far.
So the next question asks about the intersection of two very important issues, space and cyber, both of which where there have been challenges to international cooperation. And our questioner asks, an anonymous attendee asks, how significant is the concern of cyber attacks against satellites? And I would, sort of add to that, and what, given some of the in thinking about like this, like cyber GGEs, for example, Madam Secretary, and some of the challenges that we've had in getting to agreements, how should we think about prospects for cooperation then, or issues at the intersection essentially of cyber and space?
Right. Sort of technically, technologically, how likely these cyber attacks against satellites are, I will leave it to technical experts. But definitely, all sorts of concerns were raised when it comes to cyber capabilities. And that's why at the United Nations for the past 20 years or so, member states actually have been discussing. And then last year, we did see some important progress, both in terms of a group of governmental experts that had a really rich, frankly speaking, I was not really expecting that, for the GGE to adopt by consensus quite rich guidance on how to implement, again, go back to the same terminology of responsible state behavior, how to implement those 11 voluntary norms. Very rich guidance materials have been adopted by consensus. Similarly, in the open-ended working group, last year, they managed to adopt by consensus a report which talked about not just the norms, but also capacity building for all states to be able to understand and implement those norms, and confidence building measures, how to build confidence in cyberspace, cyber domains. So I think, like in outer space, member states have realized that this is an ungoverned or not sufficiently governed domain, new domain, that urgently requires some sort of a guidance framework, norms, principles, and eventually, obviously, agreement that is legally binding. So we're in the process of, working towards that. What I think what is really needed now is that political willingness and understanding on the part of all member states that despite this really difficult geopolitical environments, it will be in the interest of all states to have rules of the game. If we don't have it, it will, in the end, harm everyone. So I think we need to make sure that those things actually are going to have some progress. I would like to actually end, this really points us to one important point, which is that the concept of stability, strategic stability, is also needs to be updated. It's no longer just maintained by nuclear weapons, but it's an intersection of those weapons of mass destruction and the new technologies and new domains. So we need to put our heads together against the background of this really difficult international security environment. We need to put our heads together and come up with what is it that we need in order for us to be able to maintain stability, and then, of course, move towards better, more sort of a secure world for all of us. And cyber, both cyber and outer space, are critical components now of that discussion.
As it stands, the act of disrupting critical infrastructure for energy, communications, for any of the basic services and functions we count on every day, for power generation, for again, the capacity to communicate and relay information. All of that becomes a very, very extremely high risk consequence of a cyber attack. And that in and of itself is an act of war. And more, I think across the globe, we're beginning to embrace that notion that this is a effective means of warfare by an entirely different mechanism, and one in which the disruption is equally cataclysmic in terms of its consequences of not only disruption, but chaos and disorientation in this case, to respond in a negative manner. Well, in space, that's the dominant domain for which the communications network is now dependent. And, it doesn't take a whole lot for anybody to imagine what happens when the Wi-Fi goes out in your house. Suddenly everything's, completely destabilized and disrupted and causes all manner of different issues. Well, magnify that by multiples, and now you've got exactly the consequence of what that act could produce. And it is a completely different mechanism in this modern era of warfare that we never imagined going forward. So, I think, there's no question the global governance processes have really got a major challenge to work through this one to understand what is going to be the conventional behavior that we seek to do, and what is it that constitutes exceptions from it. Those who decide that it doesn't apply to them, how do you treat that? How do you regulate it? This is not going to be an easy one either. And it will stretch to space just by virtue of the fact that's the domain in which this operates.
So we've had a few UN-oriented questions, and now we have a US-oriented question, which is, and so why don't we start with Mr. O'Keefe here, and then Madam Secretary, you can jump in if you want, which is, how has the US government approach to space changed over the last several years, and specifically with the creation of the Space Force? How important do you think does that signal the US doing something different, or is it more doing the same thing but organized differently?
I personally believe it is doing the same things organized differently. And the advocates of Space Force and its creation felt as though the United States Air Force was not tendering sufficient focus to space-related assets as it should have. And as a consequence, carved out the Space Force that existed within the Defense Department overall to amalgamate and come around those space assets that were already in motion. So this is a new organizational construct. It has new leadership. It has a set of rules that the United States government enacted that forces the advancement, development, promotion, et cetera, of folks with those capabilities in a space domain to have an equal, if not better, chance of being competitive for advancement, promotion, et cetera. And that's its primary difference. It's now, raising the visibility of the space assets that were in place and underway prior to this. And I've struggled to find where any new efforts are moving forward as a consequence of this, but it's early. I mean, this is all of a year that's been into this. And we'll see if the advocates who really insisted on seeing this as a separate organizational construct were justified in doing so. And the detractors, on the other hand, view this as just another layer of overhead that's necessary to get to where you want to go. So from a content standpoint, it hasn't changed, but we'll see. If the advocates are absolutely right, this should speed the attention, focus, and awareness of space assets and capabilities from a defensive standpoint much more clearly. It has no consequence, really, on a commercial side of it. And there is no particular intent to organize this for an interface with commercial activity in space at all. This is more focused in the direction of the capacity of national security related assets, defense oriented, as well as intelligence oriented, to be as efficient and coherent in the way those strategies ought to be formulated as we possibly can be. And we'll see how that plays out over this test of time.
Madam Secretary, do you want to jump in on this? All right. The next question, which is for both of you, is from Paige Cohn, who's one of our panelists for the workshop later today. And Dr. Cohn asks, how do the changing power dynamics in the international system influence space now that we have several space powers rather than just two space powers? And how do you think that changed from more of a a bipolar to a multipolar sort of space world, or not space world, space domain? How will that influence the potential for cooperation? Maybe Madam Secretary, if you want to go first, and then Mr. O'Keefe.
This is such a good question. We have been thinking about this particular question, not just in space areas, but in fact, in all international security and disarmament areas. I mean, nuclear, the same, nuclear weapons is the same, and all of the other technology areas, artificial intelligence, the missile technologies, outer space, cyber, etc. One thing is very clear, it makes international multilateral discussions so much more complicated and complex and more difficult. And it also makes it, really difficult to create atmosphere that is conducive in the multilateral settings. And I think what's really important is that we need to, better understand the incentive structures, what will actually bring those different actors together, what actually is a common interest that those, the sort of center of powers actually might be able to agree on. So definitely the impact is that is making our work much more difficult, much more complex. And in this context, I think it's it's interesting also to observe how different powers actually have a slightly different nuances when they actually engage in multilateral discussions. I'm not going to get into too much of details, but I think there is a definitely, understanding that it's a little bit unrealistic to just focus on the technology or military capability themselves only, but there will have to be a focus on what will be a responsible behavior. Again, going back to this notion of looking at the responsible behavior. And it's also a reality that those military capabilities, i.e. the technologies themselves, are no longer just military technologies. These are multiple use or dual use technologies that it is just simply not possible to restrict and regulate the capabilities only. So I think it's a new and interesting dynamics entering into security conversations. This is just the reality of the 21st century, I'm afraid. But it has gotten very, very complicated. My end note is that, therefore, it's important also for smaller countries, non-military powers, also to come together and then, collectively voice their, views, so that they will be able to push the conversations that tend to actually only take place amongst the major sort of military powers. I don't think that is correct. I think there are important roles that non-military powers, middle powers, etc., can play, so that they will be able to push, the conversations in these areas forward.
I fully agree that this is a management challenge, no question. Dealing with a multitude of different competent players in the space domain is going to compound some of the challenges, I think, that the Madam Secretary, that you explained very clearly. The flip side of this, though, is this is an exciting time. It's unbelievable to see the proliferation of capability like this across the globe. I always found it fascinating in my time at NASA that NASA had more international collaborative arrangements than any other federal agency I had ever been involved with. I mean, it was incredible. And it was primarily because there were capabilities that each nation state brought to the problem to solve or find solutions to those issues of climate change, of any number of different issues that affect humans on this planet in ways that has nothing to do with sovereignty. It's entirely because of the nature of where we live on this globe. And I was just fascinated to see just the sheer expanse of depth of expertise that could be found in lots of places around the globe that now are increasing dramatically. That we see the technology that has been shared, the information, the knowledge base that has become so much more available across the world to really expand, to make some of those intractable problems that much more possible to confront when we do so collaboratively as partners and working through it. And seeing the range of, again, how the space exploration activities will go through and codified best by things like the Artemis Accords and so forth, is a great expression of exactly the way we've changed our mindset of viewing this not as a national objective as much as it is a human objective that we all share, that we all can address. So yes, there's no question. The good news is there's a lot more out there. The difficulty is there's a lot more out there, and that's going to create some management challenges that are not insignificant by any means. We've spent a lot of time talking about many of those, but at the same time, this is in the nature of good problems to have. I'll take this one over the very bipolar condition we emerged from post-Cold War. That was just one that was an intractable condition that prohibited an awful lot of that information sharing. Now we're in a different place if we can just keep it that way.
So that was a very cheery note, actually, and we only have a minute left. And so then let me turn to Madam Secretary and give her the final word, asking her to tell us something cheery. In that, what are you, we've talked a lot about the challenges to cooperation. We've talked a lot about about the problems and the threats. So what's something that maybe makes you optimistic about the future of space and the areas that you that you work on?
Yeah, young people, definitely we're in a very difficult world at the moment. But there are still a lot of young people who want to engage, who want to discuss across national borders. And those are the people who will definitely change the future. As they start to engage in our conversations today, I think those are where the future is. And so, we are really encouraging younger people, and younger people, when I say in different communities, some young diplomats, sure, but also private sector people, scientists, young engineers, in corporations. They actually come to the United Nations wanting to have discussions and work with us and work with government people. So when we have these fresh perspectives and innovative ideas, I think the future actually is going to be fine. So that's my sort of optimistic end note, but I really mean it.
Well, we're out of time. And so thank you very much, Madam Secretary, Mr. O'Keefe, for your remarks today. It's been a real honor to have both of you here to talk to us about challenges surrounding and opportunities surrounding international cooperation, international security in space. We really appreciate your taking the time, and thanks to the audience as well for joining us. And we hope to see you again on Tuesday, March 29th at 12 p.m. for From Catastrophe to Cooperation: New Approaches to Climate Migration, which will be a Zoom-only program of Perry Worldhouse featuring Michelle Layton and Coco Warner of the United Nations. As always, you can access this program on the Perry Worldhouse YouTube channel, and you can find out about all the great events we have planned for the rest of the semester by joining our mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we'll drop links to all of that in the chat as well. Thank you, all of us, for being here today. Thank you again to both of our distinguished keynote panelists. And I hope that everybody has a great day.
Thank you.